Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Magnifying HR Voices. My name is Julie Turney, and I am your host. How are you doing? We are at the start of another week, and it's Hump Day. Happy Hump Day, everyone. The conversation that we are going to have today, oh my goodness. Listen, this is the first time since the last episode that I did earlier this year with Jennifer McClure and Tracy Sponenberg that I've actually had more than one person on the show today. And today I have, for your listening pleasure, Sejal Thakkar and Karen Fleshman. So I'm going to bring them up. Hello, ladies. How are you doing today?
Great.
Super excited.
Awesome. So we are talking about unconscious bias and how do we create belonging in the workplace where so many biases exist. And I know that this is such a crucial topic that we need to spend time on today. I see the rooms are starting to get full, and I should have remembered to say I'm experimenting in my true agile form with a couple set of technologies today. So normally I stream directly to LinkedIn, occasionally sometimes to YouTube, but today I'm testing YouTube and Facebook. So making sure that we can see everyone on all of those platforms, and I think we're pretty good to go. So if there are any questions either way, we should be able to see them. Tell us where you're joining us from, everybody, as you come in. I see we have people joining the room, and I don't know, I think everyone's here for you, Karen and Sejal. So before we get started, let's just kick off with introductions. Tell us who you are, how you got here. I'm going to leave the screen and I'm going to leave you guys to just introduce yourselves to everyone and just share a little bit about why this topic matters to you and why you think we need to be having this conversation today. So Sejal, you want to go first, and then Karen, and I will see you shortly when you guys are finished.
Sure. Thank you so much. And oh my God, the chat is blowing up. Hey, Paul. Hey, Tyler. I see a bunch of people there. This topic is super important, Julie, and I'm so glad that you are having us talk about it today. These are some tough conversations to have. I've been passionate about this topic for a long time. So I think, I want to just give a little bit of my background. I'm a daughter of immigrants. So my parents actually moved from India to the United States in 1974. So I grew up with sort of always reconciling the Indian and American culture. And so kind of being in between those two cultures really shaped my views and perspectives on this topic today. And then also, I think another part of my journey that's important to this conversation is, I've experienced bias firsthand growing up as being the only Indian family in a predominantly Italian neighborhood. So I've had to deal with harassment and bullying in my life. And so I've got to see bias from a lot of different perspectives. And so I've seen how there is such lack of awareness on this topic and education. I mean, I'm an attorney and I didn't really understand how unconscious bias works until way into my career. And when I learned about it, I was like, holy, how do I not know about this already? Right. So I'm doing everything I can to raise awareness on it. And then I'll pass it over to Karen, my colleague here, who's just amazing.
Thank you, Sejal. And right back at you. You are so amazing. And I'm so grateful that we are friends. And I learned so much from you. So I am not the child of immigrants. I'm the child of white people. And I grew up in an almost entirely white community. But my childhood best friend, who's still my best friend, the godmother to my children, was an immigrant. She was a refugee from the former Soviet Union who was Jewish, brunette. I mean, this was a height of the Cold War when she moved to our town in Colorado, and she was subjected to tremendous bullying. So I was her ally. I was her support. And I also realized how much my life changed. I know we would not be having this conversation if her family had not chosen to move to our town. So that was kind of my introduction to belonging. And I am also an attorney, and similar to you know, I did not realize so much about racism, America's racial history, all of it, until much later on doing my own independent study. And what I'm super passionate about is not only talking about unconscious bias, but talking about the vicious cycle of unconscious bias, segregation, systemic racism, unconscious bias, and how do we disrupt this cycle? Because I think it's really important whenever we talk about unconscious bias, we have to contextualize it, that it's not just that we have these stereotypes, but someone very intentionally created these stereotypes, made them so pervasive, and we have to have that part of the conversation as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm so glad you're adding that perspective to this conversation, because that's one of the first things I was going to say was we really need to make sure we're all on the same page, that there's a difference between like the different types of bias, right? There's the conscious bias and the unconscious bias, and how those have different impacts. And so we'll get into that a little bit later on too. So yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. I am absolutely ready to have this conversation. I too am the child of immigrants. And so my parents met in the UK. And so I was born and raised in the UK. And my grandmother moved from Barbados to the UK when I was before I existed. uh, when my mother was very young in her teenage years, and then she moved her sisters, over to the UK, all in their teenage years, and so they were all part of the Windrush generation in the UK. And I always remember my grandmother telling me the first story I ever heard with my experience with racism was through my grandmother's eyes, when she talked about being a nurse in the UK NHS National Health System. And she talked about this lady who was very ill on the ward, and she went as a nurse to help. And this lady threw urine on her. And that was the first, and called her a gollywog. So that was my first story of ever hearing about anything like that ever happening in my family. I mean, you watch certain movies, but then when you see it happening in real life, in real time, through someone else's eyes, it was just very boggling to me. And then I remember my mom telling me her first experience moving from Barbados to the UK, and she was working in a factory. And she said that her experience was with this lady who came up to her on the job and said to her, "Show me your tail. I heard that Black people have tails, that you guys are monkeys and you have tails." And my mom, being the Caribbean woman that she is, that did not go down very well. But that was my mom's first experience. And then I remember my first experience being 13, going to high school for the first time, and the bus stop that took me to school, I had to cross over the road, and there was this white girl who lived on my street, who told me I could never cross the road when she was there to get the bus to go to school. My dad was a bus driver at the time. And so he one morning actually saw me on the opposite side of the road. And he was like, "Julie, why are you on the opposite side of the road? You have to go to school. Your school is that way." And I was like, "Well, that girl there, over there, said that I can't cross the road to catch the bus to go to school, or she'll beat me up." And I remember my dad telling my mom about it. And my mom, when I came home from school that evening, my mom walked me across the road, walked into their house, and said, "Listen, this is what your daughter is doing to my daughter. It's not cool." And, she said, "The next time this happens again, the story will end a lot differently. So tell your daughter to see my daughter and don't see her." And those are the experiences. And I mean, I've had so many more in my lifetime with experiencing racism in those spaces. I mean, I've lived in Barbados for, I would say, most of my life now, because we moved here when I was 13. But then you experience a different type of racism. You still experience racism because you have people of different races here as well. And I have experienced racism from white people in Barbados. And so you still have these things happening in the workplace, in society, everywhere around you. And so while some of them may be conscious, I've experienced a lot of unconscious bias and conscious bias. I've experienced unconscious bias in people looking at me a certain way because I am plus size and I'm not skinny. Fat phobia is very real, and I've experienced that for most of my life. And so these are a lot of the things that I feel like it's really important for us to have these conversations. But I want us to have this conversation in a way that, let's say we were talking about this for the first time ever, because the internet is forever, this content is forever. Let's educate people. What is unconscious bias, ladies? What is it? Sejal.
Okay, yeah. So great. I love level setting too, because I think that the word bias has gotten so many different meanings attached to it. So I think it's important to also, when we talk about unconscious bias, right? It's basically just, how our brain processes information, right? There's all this information that's constantly coming at it. So your brain doesn't have a full opportunity to really interpret all of that information that's coming in, right? I think Harvard said there was like 11 million pieces of information that are being processed by our brain every single second. Mm-hmm. And our brain is consciously only aware of 50 of those, right? So all of that rest of that information that's coming in, you see somebody, you make these automatic judgments, assumptions, it's based on these shortcuts that are taking place by your brain to constantly sort that information that's coming in. And so when we talk about unconscious bias, it's that you've got all these hidden beliefs or biases that are resulting from these shortcuts that your brain takes, which is very normal. But then what ends up happening is now you see somebody and you're making all these spontaneous judgments about them, not even aware that it's happening. Right. So they said one of the statistics that I always like to share, because it really kind of helps us understand this, is that you see somebody for the first time, right? You're making 7 judgments about them in just 11. The other way around. You're making 11 judgments about them in 7 seconds, right? That's before you even talk to that person. So that all of that is happening unconsciously. You're not aware of it. And then it's taking those initial judgments that you make about that person, and automatically, again, this happens for everybody, it associates those characteristics with other characteristics. Like, so you might see somebody and they've got research to say that each one of us, when we see somebody, the first things we notice about somebody is their race, their age, and their sex. Like every single person that we see, we automatically, unconsciously make these judgments about that person based in those categories. And then unconsciously, your brain is going to then associate those characteristics with others, like education. I wonder where they went to school. What's their social status? So you've made all these initial impressions about this person before you've even talked to them, right? Based on what you've been exposed to, based on your lived experiences. It's just normal functioning of how the brain works. But then the problem is what we're going to be talking about is then you are now engaging in behaviors without being aware of them that might be good for some people, right? It might be a favorable unconscious bias towards somebody, or it could be negative, where now you're going to unconsciously make some negative comments or do something towards somebody that you're not even aware that you're doing, and you're sending off the wrong signals to people, right? So I'm sorry for that long story, but it's a very important to understand that it's normal. Unconscious bias has happened to all of us. And the point that we're doing right now is to start to educate people on why we all need to do our own individual work, because all of our unconscious biases are going to be different from one person to the next. We've gone through different experiences, right? And thank you, Julie, so much for sharing your experiences with racism and bias, what you've dealt with. But those were based on what those other individuals had gone through in their lives, and now they're making judgments or making you feel a certain way, right? We all do that in some way or the other to everybody. And it's just unfortunately, a lot of people, like the people that you're talking about, have been allowed to get away with it for so long, so that now it's become a part of our culture. And
Mm-hmm.
so this is the only way we can get through this, is by just having these conversations. So thank you again for inviting me to this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Karen, please share.
Yeah, I would just add that, as I mentioned earlier, the negative stereotypes and assumptions that we have about people based on their gender and race did not come out of nowhere. They were very intentionally created by power, whether we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about England, the United States, Barbados, that white property owning men, um, many of whom owned enslaved people, created a gendered racist belief system that said they are the ones who should be in charge and the natural leaders, and they have the right to bear arms and run everything. And then underneath them are white women who must be protected from the savage, predatory black men and native men who are likely to attack them. And then underneath them are the black men and native men who are not really human beings. They are monkeys. They are subhuman and therefore deserving of harm. And then underneath them are black women, native women, etc., who are terrible mothers, bad people, wanton, and also therefore deserving of harm. And they created this belief system and punished and rewarded us for following the belief system with tremendous violence. And so it's no wonder why 500 years into our history, these stereotypes continue to be propagated in our culture, in our
Mm-hmm.
media, in our advertising, in TV. And so from a very early age, like are babies absorb these messages and develop these preferences. And
Mm-hmm.
so we have to work, it's a lifelong journey to unlearn these stereotypes. And part of it is understanding who originated them and why.
Yeah. I think this is such an important topic, and I see. Thank you so much to everyone that's joined us today. I see everyone showing some form of appreciation for the fact that we're having this conversation today. I see Michelle Smith is saying, sadly, I still see this in nursing today. Some care staff can be treated so badly, yet people really step up and challenge this. Absolutely. And it broke my heart hearing that as a young child, hear my grandmother share that story, to know that that's still something that's happening today. Like, I don't doubt it. I just think, like, it makes me so sick to my stomach to know that we've come a certain way, and yet still it almost feels like we haven't progressed at all.
And this is why we need folks to be upstanders. We need folks to disrupt this. And it can't be the person who is being harmed, right? When we ourselves are being harmed, our body's physiological response is to shut down,
Yeah.
to protect ourselves. So we need our colleagues who are observing what's going on and courageous and stepping in to say, hey, what you are doing is wrong and it's harmful and you need to
Mm-hmm.
stop.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh my God. Can I just give you like a high
Absolutely.
five through the screen? Like, what? That's mic
Yeah.
drop. That's a mic drop moment, Karen.
So we're
Seriously.
talking about creating a safe space or a place of belonging in the workplace. But first, I think it's important for us to identify, like, what are some of those unconscious biases or biases that exist in the workplace today, that both of you as attorneys, or in your capacity now as HR people, because I know, Sejal, you are now um, taking on that role in your organization, Nobody Studios. And I just want to like bring to the fore, like, what are some of those things that we hear on a daily basis that we know are like, no, this just doesn't work.
What are some of the stereotypes that pervade the workplace?
Yeah, what are some of the
Well,
things we hear? Like, let me
yeah,
touch your
that
hair.
Black women are angry, that Latina women are feisty and spicy, and Asian American women are docile, and um, Asian American men, are very intelligent and have great skills, but they're not real leaders. Um, uh, so many different stereotypes.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a tough question too, Julie, because with both of us, I've done employment law, so we've seen every type of case. I mean, I primarily focused on discrimination and harassment cases, and I'll tell you, I mean, this is really what led me to starting my own company and doing education full time, was because a lot of these people that were getting sued, they were getting they this was the first time they were being addressed. This behavior was being addressed. Nobody had ever confronted this individual or counseled them, or said, hey, by the way, you can't say that to this person. You can't make these kind of comments. You can't interrupt. You can't change the tone of your voice when you're talking to this person versus everybody else. You can't not give somebody different. This is what I'm talking about, is we need to start addressing this way earlier in the game, And so I think the more important conversation is, how do we empower, as Karen was saying, how do we empower people to understand and to understand, like, hey, when I see something happening, regardless of the type of unconscious bias or type of behavior, let's start addressing it earlier on so that we don't even get to the point where it's illegal. We're not going to tolerate that behavior that's deeply ingrained into our systems, into our culture. We're just not going to tolerate that. And so when we see somebody, and this is the whole thing, we're not canceling culture. That's not what I'm talking about. This has to be where we're just sending a message. If we're in organizations, we're sending the message saying, we're just not going to tolerate racist, sexist, anything. We're not even going to get to that point where we have to label it that way, but we're going to come way short of that and say, we're just not going to tolerate that behavior. That's one side of it. But on the other side is also having that honest conversation about looking at all the different processes, policies, structures within your organization for existing institutional bias, and figuring out, how are we going to root this stuff out of here? For some places, it's going to take more work than others. Like at Nobody Studios, it's not that difficult because we're building everything from scratch. So we are making sure to keep that as a laser focus for us, to ingrain these things into what we're already going to be doing as we scale, right? So, but if you're already set up and going, that's going to take some effort. And this isn't something that you just say, I'm going to bring one consultant in, do one training, or I'm going to bring somebody in and do, no, this is about walking the talk, right? And so it's a lot of hard work, but the benefits are totally worth it, right? So
Yes, it's like practice what you preach or change your speech, right?
yes.
But what is that up front? Like, let's understand what it is up front. And that's why I wanted to kind of like break it down. Like, we were having this conversation with people who've never had this conversation before. We want them to understand like what it is, what it looks like. But I also want to talk about, and this is where a lot of HR professionals get the long end of the, or the short end of the stick. When these things are happening in the workplace, a lot of times people go, well, like, HR knew and didn't say anything, didn't do anything. The onus is not always on HR, but then I always hear HR professionals say, well, yes, I did hear that. Yes, I did see that. And why was I complicit? And a lot of times then we start to feel guilty about being complicit and not calling it out. Why do we struggle with calling it out? What makes it so hard to call it out? I mean, I don't have that issue. Whenever I see it, I call it, because
None of us do.
I've, like, I've grown up with that my entire life. So when I see it, I pull people aside and I go, hey, that thing you said right there, not acceptable. That thing you did right there, no, 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 we're not doing that. But there are a lot of HR professionals who do struggle with calling these things out. Why, Karen?
Well, I think it has to do with power and trauma response, right? So how where did HR originate? Labor used to negotiate with management in labor unions, right? But after we decimated labor unions, management tried to negotiate directly with labor. That wasn't working out so well. So they created HR to be the intermediary between management and labor. But always HR's function has been to protect the company, to protect the management, and not to be on the side of the worker. And because HR is not seen as a profit center, it is not properly resourced, et cetera, et cetera. It's like um, imperative is to please management to
Mm,
continue to have resources. And I think those underlying power dynamics very much come out in the way that HR shows up in the workplace. And that's why, for way too long, the function of HR has been very similar to the way cities in the United States handle police brutality, which
mm,
is a person gets killed by police, the city pays a small sum of money to the family and makes it go away and keeps the police who harmed that person on the force. Same thing in HR. The imperative is get the person who raised the complaint out of here as cheaply as possible, and we're going to keep the person who caused the harm here and continue to allow this culture to continue. So really HR has to ask itself, what is our role? What do we want our legacy to be? Do we want our legacy to be a harmful workplace where perpetrators continue in positions of power? Or do we want our legacy to be a harm-free workplace where we make the people who cause the harm go away and change the culture so that harm does not continue to happen?
yeah, I saw a lot of light bulbs go off as you spoke in the chat. So people are definitely resonating with what you said. I totally agree because I think that if we don't change as a function what is happening, it will continue. We will continue to have this vicious cycle, and we will continue to be misunderstood. I think the lack of bravery comes from not having the support too. And that's why I think community is so important. Like I know now that I'm not alone, that I don't walk this talk alone, that I have amazing women that I can call on and I can say, Sejal, Karen, this is what's happening in my space. I'm a little nervous about this conversation, but help me structure it in such a way. And I think HR needs more of that. We try too much to do stuff on our own and be like, oh, I know it all. And like, I've been here for so long. But we have to come from a space of it's time to unlearn and relearn and reskill ourselves so that these things can start to change. Otherwise, we're going to continue in this vicious cycle, which, as you said, we really need to do better. Sejal, do you want to add anything to that?
No, the only thing I'm going to add is because this is just such a wonderful perspectives from both of you is just to, I think being in HR is a very difficult job right now. It's one of the hardest jobs to have. So I have mad respect for HR people, and what I've heard in just my legal career and working with so many different HR folks is that the fear of retaliation is real for these individuals, right? And we're seeing a lot of people leaving right now. We're seeing a lot of people, just abruptly say, I'm going to be starting somewhere new in a different job. And so I think the underlying message is that people, don't speak up about these situations when they're seeing them because they're afraid that their jobs are going to be in danger. And that's a real threat. I mean, retaliation continues to be the number one complaint filed across the United States by people, right? So I think, but what you just said was just, it hit that nail on the head. Is I think my only addition to what both of you said would be that, look, as HR folks, as attorneys, whatever, whoever, I think it's important that if we're talking just as HR folks, that you talk about your struggles. And Julie, what you're trying to do is talk about the fact that you're doing this work, that you're going through the training, understanding your own biases. What are some of the things, the lessons you're learning from your experience and your journey, and how are you walking your talk as HR? Because, if you just say you care about culture, like a lot of people do, and then there's like zero resources behind it, that's not going to be very, people are not going to really find that believable, right, or credible. So I think unfortunately HR really needs to overcome that fear of retaliation. That would be my biggest thing. And then talk more openly with other people about your struggles. That's the part that I think HR needs. That's how they're going to get. Unfortunately, we all know this. There's a really bad reputation, that employees don't trust HR because they think they're management sided. And that was never supposed to be HR's function, even though that's the way it's come out. HR really should be neutral. If we do this right, they should be resource, right? A resource for employees to be able to go to and get some kind of guidance. And unfortunately, that's not what a lot of employees believe. That's not what they're. So underlyingly, there's that trust that's missing. So one way to gain that trust is by being vulnerable, that I'm going through this journey with you. I'm doing the work, right? And be open about that. So that would be the only thing I'd add to that.
Yeah, definitely agree with that, because I think that if we're not, I always keep saying this, the power of vulnerability, the power of sharing your story, no matter what it is. But I don't know why it is that as HR we continue to struggle with sharing and being that open and being that honest. And I think that as I continue to coach HR professionals and say, look, you need to know your people. Do you know your people? Are you getting up and walking around and talking to your people? Are you holding space for your people in an intentional way? And a lot of times they're like, I don't have that time. I've got this to do and I've got that to do. There's nothing more important than your people.
That's right.
Nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding who they are and how they make up this organization that you are working for. You are serving people.
Love it.
But to your point on with regards to the challenge that we have with feeling like there will be repercussions if we speak out. Now, from a legal perspective, what advice would you give when it comes to that? Because obviously we got to be able to cross this barrier, and in order to cross this barrier, it's going to take a set of fearless and brave people to do it. But if when we have that repercussion conversation happening, what advice would you give to HR right now on how to buffer that, to deal with that? Shall we start with Karen?
Yeah, well, I would say right now, at least in the United States, power is shifting to the workers because we're in the midst of the great resignation, and workers are leaving companies where they don't feel that they belong. So I think this is also, way too many HR people are in that position because they are gatekeepers, and they want that, they fawn over the leadership and try to maintain the leadership in power. So I want a new bolder group of HR to talk to the leadership and say, hey, our function should really be creating a culture where people thrive. If our people are thriving, they are going to produce great services and products, and our company is going to thrive. If our people are miserable and they're being harmed, they're going to leave. They're going to, not be, uh, uh, we're not going to have a
Happy and engaged employees. Yeah.
yes. So let me use what I know how to do to create a thriving culture and work collaboratively with the employees, and let's figure out a way to hold managers to account, because the people who have the most impact on the
Mm-hmm.
day-to-day work culture are those managers. And if they're not being trained properly, and if they're not being held to account for diversity, equity, belonging on
Yeah.
the team, if they're not recognizing when harm is causing, or if they themselves are causing harm, that is going to cause the entire culture to be terrible. So
Yeah.
let's really focus on that manager role,
Mm-hmm.
and provide the proper training for managers. But if managers can't do it, if managers are unwilling to develop the skill set of leading a diverse team, then we're going to have to let them go. And that includes executives and everybody else, because they're the ones who are setting the tone. It doesn't matter what it says in the policy handbook. What matters is the behavior of people in positions of power. So if
Mm-hmm.
they're demonstrating you can cause harm here with total impunity, you can't change the culture. Okay, you have to make sure that everyone in a position of leadership is singing from the same hymn book, and living these practices, if you want people to have confidence that they can actually belong.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I'm loving the comments that are happening in the chat as well. And Paul is saying, and to your point, core values that guide the company's belonging either stir the care of the individual or force control and fit. The ways we belong is a boundary. It either values the people or devalues people in pursuit of preserving the tribe and its purpose. And he also made another comment here, and I'm going to come back to this one because I want you guys to give your thoughts on it. But then he also said that HR will get its power in belonging that it creates people as a bottom line. Sejal.
Yeah, I mean, I love all these comments by Paul. Thanks, Paul, for coming here today.
Yeah.
He does some amazing work with helping people understand what belonging is and looking at really, he's when I have like 2 or 3 conversations I've had with Paul, I've literally had like 8 to 10 pages of notes every time, because he really gets the science behind how we connect with one another and
Yeah.
what behaviors we want to look at, right? So I just want to talk about this core value piece real quickly, because I think this is so important. We see lots of organizations have these beautiful core values, right? And then, but you ask the people, even just on their leadership team, what these core values mean, and they can't really, they're not in agreement.
Value.
So,
Mm-hmm.
going back to singing from the same handbook, let's start with singing the same core values, right?
Yep.
And then taking that to the next step, which is really what I think Paul's going to here, is taking that core value and then identifying what are the specific behaviors that we say fall under belonging. So belonging is a core value, which it should be a part of your whatever. At Nobody Studios, we put belonging under our people first core value, right? So underneath our people first, we've got things like civility, belonging, and those kinds of things, right? So looking at it, saying, let's start with 10 behaviors that fall underneath belonging, right? And so you list those out, and then make sure you communicate that to everybody so everybody understands, because belonging can mean like 20 different things. You ask 20 different people and they're all going to define it separately. So you want
Yep.
to define it for your organization and then communicate that along with the behaviors so people know what is expected. And then going to Karen's point, then you have to have accountability, right? Accountability is critical. And I think we want to position it as HR folks and people that are going to be making the push for accountability within the organization. It usually ends up falling on HR's plate most of the time.
Yeah.
But position it as a tool of empowerment and
Mhm.
effectiveness, right? So looking at empowering people to be a part of this, that gets rewarded, right? And then measuring against certain goals that you have for these people. And it's not a one-time thing, right? It's holding people accountable at all levels. This is something that it's got to be shared throughout the organization. It
Yes.
cannot just be strictly on HR. It cannot just strictly be on the lawyers. It literally has to be effective, that responsibility and accountability has to be shared throughout the organization from top to bottom, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And everybody in between. So.
Yes. Yes. Karen, do you want to add anything to that?
I would just add that you know, it remains to be seen. Can in capitalism, can we truly value labor? Can we truly create belonging? Because capitalism thrives off of surplus labor and
Hmm.
off of othering people. And here we are in the United States where 43% of millennials are people of color, 47% of Gen Z are people of color.
Hmm.
So, are we going to, they're coming into the workplace with very high expectations that
Expectations. Yeah.
people understand intersectionality and microaggressions and all this stuff. And people in my generation are looking at them like, what? I've
What
never
are you
even
talking
heard of
about?
that. Like, what are you talking about? So are we going to adapt and transform the workplace to make it safe, to create psychological safety for folks? Or are we just going to keep churning through folks and trying to pay the minimum amount and you know um it remains to be seen. But I
Yeah.
think that companies that do decide, okay, we are going to create a workplace that is psychologically safe
Safe.
for the
Hmm.
most marginalized person, that the most marginalized person in our workplace can make a mistake and they will not be like admonished for it.
Right.
They will be treated as if the most privileged person in our workplace makes a mistake. They
Hmm.
will be treated the exact same. Then I think those are the kinds of workplaces that will attract and retain really great talent.
Yep. Yeah, and I totally agree with you, Karen. The only thing I would add to that too is this is why it's important to create these kinds of spaces where we can talk about these issues, right? So when as because I think what we said even before we started recording this, right, in our backstage
Hmm.
is that people that have been doing this now, I mean, we've been on full steam ahead. I know all three of us have been really
Hmm.
working hard to raise awareness on these issues. We're getting tired, it's starting to feel the burn. I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
I'm needing to take more breaks in between things, because I'm just feeling like it's heavy. It's taking a toll on me.
Hmm.
What we really want to do is create more spaces, especially for HR in an organization where we can talk about these issues and discuss what needs to be done together collaboratively, right?
Yeah.
So it's really about once we create more spaces, the goal is for the entire company or the entire organization to be that big space where
Hmm.
people can share their opinions, where people can be heard, where people can be valued, where we can ask people for feedback. Because guess what? This is a genius. Ask the people who are impacted by the policies, by the procedures, and how we can make it better.
Hmm.
Like it's not that difficult.
It's not.
It's
It
really
really
not.
is not.
And there is no one size. There is no one size. You know, your diversity that you have within your organization is different from the one sitting next to you, right? It's
Hmm.
made up of the people within your organization. So ask your people and foster those spaces where there's more opportunities to collaborate, more opportunities to be able to say to somebody, okay, thank you for sharing that. Like I learned when you shared your instances of when you were first exposed to racism, I learned about you and I've had several conversations with you. of things that I didn't know about you. Like that,
Yeah.
we just got more deeply connected because I
Hmm.
learned more about your journey. But this is the thing, in this country, especially, I'm just talking about this country, right? We've been told the opposite. We've been told, don't talk about it.
Yeah.
Don't talk about these issues, and if you do, you're a troublemaker, or
Hmm.
you're going to suffer in some way, and that's the message that's been sent. And so that's why it's really scary for some of us that are trying to make a change that can actually get the leadership's ear to put it on blast,
Yeah.
right? Not back down from that, because you're going to have to be the one to drive that. Unfortunately, HR is such a tough role
Such a
right
tough
now,
role.
but I think it's a crucial one. And
Hmm.
I know I'm very optimistic. I don't know. I'm curious
Yeah.
to hear from both of you, but I'm optimistic
Yeah.
in the future.
I am definitely optimistic for the future. Absolutely. I feel like this is a great time to be in HR. Like, I think maybe like 2, 3 years ago, could we have these conversations on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on Facebook? Probably not. Not without being blocked, right?
Right. Well, hopefully we don't, but
Hopefully we don't. Hopefully we don't.
hopefully we go viral.
Absolutely. Because these conversations are important. And I think that what makes this so great is that we are at a stage, we've gone through something really horrific together as a human race, as a profession called HR. And I think that HR professionals are starting to realize, look, we cannot do this alone. We do need community, and we do need to have these conversations so that we can better educate ourselves first and then find ways to support the people that we serve second. And I think that this is happening. Like, I'm seeing a lot of this. But is it enough? No, I don't think it's ever going to be enough. And I think that it's consistency is key. But to your point, like, I think for the last 2 years, I pretty much gone very gun ho on having these conversations.
Yeah.
And to your point, I am tired. I'm a little exhausted.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like you need to pass the mantle and have other people share these conversations and be okay to have these conversations in these spaces, in these moments, writing the books, sharing the experiences. Like, I feel like it's important. And I could see that we're moving a little closer to people getting the point of, yeah, we need to do something differently. Karen, what about you?
Yeah, I think we need to see actual change, and we need to, I think about last summer's racial reckoning and all these commitments and promises made. And then 16 months later, how many of those promises have been fulfilled? You know? And we need to hold these companies to account,
Yeah.
to actually going forward with what they said they were going to do and
Hmm.
creating the cultural shift.
Mhm.
And I also think it's important to reward positive changes as
Yeah.
well. Like, I think so
Yeah.
much of it, we wind up being in this, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. But how could we, instead of operating from that mindset, say, do this, do this, do this, and reward it, and operate from that perspective.
Mhm.
And I think people would respond to that in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that as we continue to have these conversations and evoke serious thought in people's minds to say, it's time I try to do something a little differently, I hope that people will reach out to you guys to say, let's do something different. Paul is having fun in this chat.
Yes.
Yes.
Paul is just having his time in this chat. Paul said, create a culture of belonging to uncovering unconscious bias.
Mhm.
Hmm, absolutely. I think that these things are very important. What is the what advice do you have? Oh, I see a question. sorry, let me take this question before we start to wrap things up, because I can't believe we've just talked for 50 minutes. The show is almost over. Tyler is asking, how can we approach these conversations without our coworkers or others shutting down?
I
Good
think it's
question.
really I think it's really important to be vulnerable about our own experiences. You
Mhm.
know, hey, I noticed you just said this or did this, and I was wondering what was your intent behind that? And then listen. Like, we can't have a conversation that's just one way. We always have to listen and
Mhm.
listen to the person's experience. And then you can say, hey, there was a time when I thought that was okay too. And I did this, this, that, and that. And then I realized that actually that was really harmful because blah, 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 blah. And now I don't do that anymore. So
Mhm.
we're not coming at it like, oh, I'm this holier than thou, like
Yeah.
exalted, enlightened individual, and you are a total
Right.
dinosaur, but
So, well,
we're
you crack
speaking
me up,
from
Carol.
our
Seriously.
yes, we're speaking from our own trajectory of growth. And I think it's role modeling too, apologizing. And so, if someone points out to me that I've done something harmful, the first words out of my mouth are thank you. That was
Mhm.
a real act of courage for you
Yes.
to bring that to my attention. I'm sorry. And I name the harm that I caused. And then I work on myself. I don't burden that person with educating me. I do my own research. And
Mhm.
often I'll go back to that person weeks later and say, hey, I just want to thank you again for pointing that out. Because you pointed that out, I've now changed this behavior. And if you hadn't have pointed that out, I wouldn't have realized that what I was doing was harmful.
Yeah. Sejal, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, and just everything she just said. And again, the
So
responsibility
powerful.
falls. I mean, the responsibility falls on the bystanders, right? These are the people that are observing this go on. It is their sole responsibility to be the one to, as what Karen just described, right? Calling in that person and letting
Hmm.
them know about the harmful or potentially harmful behavior, right? And it's all about just putting that person on notice. And then it's really the responsibility on there is just to change the behavior. Because remember that what we're trying to do is we would love to be able to change everybody's beliefs. Wouldn't
Right.
that be great if we can just say, okay, from now on, nobody's going to be a racist? Like that'd be wonderful, right? Like
It would be.
we'd want to work ourselves out of that job, right? But the point is we can't do that. But what we can do is say we're not going to tolerate certain behaviors and that we're going to create an environment where we can have these conversations to call in the person because we care about you. You're a part of our organization. We value you. So we're going to create an environment where we can just let each other know that something's offending us and we're all different, right? I
Mhm.
mean, somebody can make a joke and 9 of us might laugh, but it's that one person that doesn't laugh for them because of their lived experiences, because of the way that they view the world. That wasn't something that was funny to that person. We have to respect that view as well,
Mhm.
right? And so, how do we do that? We have to eliminate those jokes, right? And it's not about the intention of the person. Did they mean that to be funny or were they trying to
Mhm.
harm that person? Intention has nothing to do with this. It's about the impact, right? It's negatively impacting one person.
Yeah.
We need to do something about it,
About
right?
it. Hmm.
That's it.
Yep. Full stop. Well said. Listen, we have to have this. We have to extend this conversation. Like I feel like we need to have some more of these conversations together, ladies. Um, there's so much more that we could talk about. Like I said, I never ever get through all of the questions that I have. But I want to ask you this, like for people, for especially for those HR professionals who are watching today or will come to this content at some point in time in the future, what are some of the places or where are some of the places that you would point them to help them with working with their organizations on uncovering unconscious bias, educating their organizations and the people they serve on this topic, and then starting to make the necessary changes. Karen or Sejal. Sejal,
Well,
go ahead.
yeah,
Sorry.
I was just gonna say, look, this is gonna take effort and hard work, no matter where you're at, right? So first thing is to start with yourself and start understanding your own hidden beliefs, your
Mm-hmm.
own biases, and educating yourself on, like, if you just think about like different types of biases, right? There's social biases, there's cognitive biases, there's institutional biases. So HR needs to do their own work first to understand all of that. And then I would just say, as far as resources go, there is so much information available online now, right? Like a lot of it's crap, but there's a lot of great information available. I know if you go onto like my website and my blog section, I'm constantly posting articles and things that I find on these topics, because I'm like, this is so important for people to understand it. But there's so many LinkedIn courses you can take, right? That
Mm-hmm.
from people that are knowledgeable in this area. And one of the books that I pulled out that I wanted to just kind of talk about, to share with everybody,
Yep.
is this one. Karen, have you read this one yet? It's by Tiffany Jana and Michael Baran, Subtle Acts of Exclusion.
No, I want
Oh,
to
it's
read
so
that.
good. It's how to understand, identify, and stop microaggressions. And microaggressions, again, we didn't really get into that topic that much, but
Right.
they are the negative behaviors that result from your unconscious bias that are very harmful to other people. So we used to call that microaggressions. I'm now starting to refer to it as subtle acts of exclusion based on this
Mhm.
book. So
Wow.
really great resource right there for people to take a look at too.
Yeah. Karen, what do you have to add?
Two great resources that are top of mind for me right now. Resma Menachem, My Grandmother's Hands, Healing from Our Racialized Trauma in Our Hearts and Bodies. I'm missing the subtitle, but I just did Resma's Somatic Abolitionism Retreat. I
Mm-hmm.
cannot recommend his work highly enough. He's like, ending racism is not an intellectual exercise. It's something that we carry in our bodies, that we
Mm-hmm.
carry from our ancestors, whether we're racialized as a body of culture or as a white body. And we have to work on our bodies, not
Yeah.
just our minds, to heal from this trauma.
Mm.
The other book I just finished yesterday, cannot recommend highly enough, is Minda Hart's Right
Yes.
Within. So good, about
Mm-hmm.
how women of color can heal from their racialized trauma. And I would urge all folks, not just women of color, to read Minda's book, because this
Mhm.
will give you so much
Yes.
insight on the harm that you are causing if you are not a woman of color, and what to do differently. And she has within there a manager's pledge,
Mm.
um, of what managers can do differently to not cause so much harm, and to just approach things with humility. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
I love that. I was actually going to say Minda Hart's book for sure. There are so many resources, but at top of mind for me would be if you're not following Shireen Daniels on LinkedIn, you need to follow Shireen Daniels,
Yes.
HR Rewired. She's sharing so much information. I cannot tell you the work that Shireen is putting out there. It all started from just creating one video to now, just sharing this information and trying really hard to help people recognize the importance of let's end racial injustices. And I remember having a conversation with her on this show a couple months back where we talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but she talked about kind of like segmenting race just because it's such a big topic. And understanding that as we talk about racial inequity in the workplace, all of these conversations, are they hard to have? Absolutely. But necessary? Definitely. And so we really need to get better at that. So yeah, definitely HR Rewired, Shireen Daniels would be my recommendation. And then there's a book that I've been reading, and I was just trying to find it again in my books, like right above me. But Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. Such a good book.
Yes.
And so,
I haven't read that. Who's the author on that one?
oh my goodness, it's oh lost. Can I call the name? Do you know what? Let me Google it really quickly. But it's such a good book. And I think also she had mentioned in this book about, just the changes that we need to make. And so many times we are constantly talking about race. I'm trying to find it while I'm talking to you. Let me look quick. And I will share it in the comments as well.
Perfect.
But for some reason, it is just not coming to me what her name is. And I know it's a name that I can't pronounce, or that I struggle to pronounce sometimes. Reni Edo, I think it is Reniedo. Yes, why
Okay.
I'm no longer talking to white people about race by Reni Edo. So yeah, definitely check that out as well. Thank you, ladies, so much for spending this time with me today. I really appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. You are both amazing. And I'm so glad that I have you as friends, as part of my community. Please let our audience know where is the best place for them to reach you on social media if they want to learn more about you and what you do. Sejal, sorry.
The best place to get a hold of me would be on LinkedIn. That's really the only social media that I'm super active on. And
Yeah.
again, that's where I put out a lot of resources on the stuff that we're talking about, because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I'm always looking for the best articles on this stuff and putting it out there. So that would be the best way to get a hold of me.
Yes. Karen?
Same, LinkedIn, and
Yeah.
also www.racyconversations.com.
Beautiful. And you know where to find me. I am on LinkedIn all day, every day. So if you need me, just drop me a line and I'd be happy to support you, share stories, have a call. I like virtual coffees, not a problem at all. Coming up next week, now we're going to start a little later next week, but coming up next week, we have Lars Schmidt joining us to discuss redefining HR. I am looking forward to this conversation as well. Lars is doing a lot of great things in the HR space, and I think also in a way that's kind of very disruptive, but very necessary for us as HR. So looking forward to having that conversation with him. Thank you so much for joining us again for another Magnifying HR Voices. I look forward to seeing you guys next week. We will be back at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time next week, Wednesday, but we'll be here nonetheless. So see you then.
Bye.